Hello, and welcome to Mending Chasms, Building Bridges and Community. My name is Leena Sharma Seth. My pronouns are she, her, and I am your host. I'm looking forward to my conversation with today's guest. And first, we open with an acknowledgement. Canada exists as we know it today because of colonization. While we work to disrupt colonial and oppression rooted practice in the work we feel called to do at Mending the Chasm, we also acknowledge our presence as uninvited guests on Brant Tract Treaty territory known as the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, the Attawandaron or Neutral, and many other Indigenous communities who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We also acknowledge the harm of colonization that resilient people of the global diaspora have experienced, including displacement, land theft, enslavement, violence, genocide, and cultural appropriation. Our aim is to work in solidarity with fellow community members to heal from the harm of colonization and to reclaim the joy, the inclusion, well-being, and liberation that is every human's birthright. My guest today is Patty Krawec. Patty is an Anishinaabe Ukrainian writer, author, and speaker belonging to Lakso First Nation and living in the Niagara region. Her work centers on building transnational solidarities. Welcome, Patty.
Hi, Lena. It's so nice to be back with you.
Wonderful. I appreciate the conversations we got to have for the previous show I hosted that some of my viewers may be familiar with, but I was like, I have to get Patty back. So thank you for saying yes. So let's get started with, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know I gave kind of a little bit of a tidbit, but, for viewers who maybe didn't see those previous conversations, what brings Patty alive?
Oh my gosh, so many things. I mean, I don't even know which version of myself I'm on right now. I've done I've been a union member and a mother and admin staff, and now I'm sort of retired, but I wrote a book because I wanted people to examine history and to challenge the stories that we're told about history, whether it's in the church or outside of the church, just to really challenge a lot of those dominant narratives about history and then kind of move them forward into, okay, so what's next? Like what next? Okay, so we've challenged these stories. So how do we become kin, become good kin, which is
Mm,
the name of the book, Becoming Kin. And that's what led me to transnational solidarities, because it really isn't so much about Indigenous people or, South Asian people or Black people. It really is about the relationships we build between us. And how can we build those relationships between us in a way that builds a more just world and doesn't just create a kinder, more inclusive settler colonialism, which is what so much diversity and equity work seems to be trying to do.
I appreciate all that so much, and just that, and that's a legacy that I take away. You organized a series of retreats on becoming kin, or based on becoming kin, across the country last year, and I had the privilege of attending one of those retreats, and I still sit with some of those insights that I walked away from that experience with, and one of them is that reminder of, there's things happening across the globe, but what I can most influence is like the relationships, the networks, interrogating my own history so that I can be in better relationships. So I've really, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's a practice I'm building, I guess, because I remember doing that reflection of like, what was the history of my people around what was happening with Indigenous people in Canada as a child of immigrants, right? Thinking about mapping that alongside. And it just gave me a lot of ahas, but also still thinking about how do I integrate that into my practice and how does that influence the way I choose to show up in community? So love that you shared that kind of, there's no over there and over here, because although we're talking transnational solidarity, that what happens here does influence and can potentially shape other spaces. So I appreciate that so much. Um, Talking about the retreats that happened last year, what was your intention with these retreats and what do you feel the impact has been?
So My intention was initially just to follow Katie into whatever it was she wanted to do. So Katie is somebody, she works with True North Aid. They're a settler organization providing funding to communities in the indigenous communities in the far north. And Katie and I found each other on social media, and she had this vision for a retreat. And at that time, my book had just come out, and I was just kind of launching on this speaker path, doing these retreats, and I had never done anything like that before. And Katie was just really interested in what would happen if we brought together a group of people over, a kind of, an intense period of time, to not just read the book or listen to me talk about the book, but to talk amongst each other about the ideas and challenges raised in the book, which was how I wound up working with Alexa Shotwell, who wrote Against Purity, and Charmaine Khan, who's a union. And she has Upping the Ante is the journal that she edits and writes for. And I think Charmaine was the one that you attended, right? Was with Charmaine Khan. And that was largely because I didn't know what I was doing. I had never done retreats before. And so I thought, well, by inviting in, these people who knew what they were doing, we would be able to have a much more effective time. And then I really valued the insights that they brought, because it made the conversations so much richer than even just what I would have to offer. And, I felt like Alexis and I were able to model Indigenous settler relations in a really good way. And then Charmaine and I were able to model those other kinds of transnational solidarities. Charmaine coming from, a Muslim background, and examining, like you said, her own experience growing up on the prairies, and her, relationship or lack of relationship, with the indigenous peoples, who lived there. So I think it was those conversations that I was really interested in. And then you brought forward something at the retreat that you participated in, um, that we carried forward into other retreats, about how do we make sure that this space is a safe space, is a good space. Klee Benali, a Dene organizer who passed earlier this year, uh, in his book, so I've got it. No spiritual surrender. I keep it like within arm's reach. He talks about creating hostile spaces. We're going to be hostile to transphobia. We're going to be hostile to white supremacy. We're going to be hostile to we're going to create a safe space by not accepting, by not allowing those things into our spaces, which I thought was kind of a neat way to think about it. Um, but you offered us some good questions that we brought forward into other, and I've used it in other retreats and even shorter workshops, just to make sure that it laid some groundwork for the hard conversations we were going to have. How are we going to name the things? Because you can't confront the things if you don't name them. But how are we going to name the things in a way that moves us forward into relationship and doesn't just kind of, devolve into, I don't know, like settler innocence, like that's a big one. And I think that's part of what you were pushing back on, was a big explosion of settler innocence, and
Ooh,
exceptionalism coming from one of the participants. And that, so that was something that I really appreciated learning from you. And that's what I really liked about these retreats, was I not only learned from my co-facilitators, but I learned from the people in the room. Like, there was one in Vancouver where we were talking about how the Canadian government just brings people in. I said to a friend of mine, oh, you're an engineer. Canada needs engineers. He's a Palestinian. And so he came to Canada only to find that the College of Engineers didn't accept his credentials. And I had made a remark that, oh, this was being an example of government bureaucracy. And a woman who was in the room who worked in refugee settlement commented, it got him off the land, didn't it? And my heart just dropped, because this goes to what you said about how we can think locally in our own communities and recognize that all of these things are connected, because they're not just similar, right? They're connected. And here's this friend of mine who was possibly tempted into Canada for the purpose of getting him off Palestinian land. And so how do we build these transnational solidarities here so that they can have that kind of broader impact? Because we're all connected to people back home, wherever back home is, right? And so the relationships we form here are going to impact what's happening in those places.
I love that. I love everything you shared, and even kind of the piece around, like, I think that be reflecting on my experience as you shared, kind of as you reflected to me the impact of what I had shared there, that idea of, what does accountability look like? Because I know I was sitting with, how do I interrupt the harm that I was feeling with, or how do I even pause so we can be curious about how people are feeling about what was being shared to our container? And that was kind of where it came from, because when we and I'm glad to hear that it was value that you could integrate into, your ongoing experiences. And because I know I was feeling called to say something, and I think others were too, but not sure how, because we didn't know what the rules were. So I love that evolution. And I think, perfection doesn't exist. But, as we build our practice with these spaces, is understanding how much more generative the space is when we can lean on some of these, I'm going to say, guidelines. So that was really great. And when you talk about transnational solidarity, I wonder if you could say more about what that means to you. Again, for viewers who might be like, what does that even mean? Do you want to say more about that?
Question. What does that even mean? It sounds like something the governments should be doing, right? With their diplomats. Isn't that what they're doing with their diplomats? They're forming no, it's things that we do in our own communities. Like tonight, and I've got my beautiful Palestinian earrings on that my friend Shelby made, and they're indigenous, right? Like there's beadwork and dentalium shells, but the Palestinian flag. And what we're doing tonight, actually, we're pulling together, and this is something that, we've done a couple of times now, and we're doing this for a third time. We're getting together the Muslim, Indigenous, and Black communities and all of the ways that those communities layer. And we're getting us all together. Tonight, the mosque, one of the local mosques is hosting it, and we're calling it Learning Together. And it really is just to bring us together. Like the drum group I belong to opened up a circle one night to welcome, because we didn't know how else to care for these women in our community who have lost so much. And so it's just, well, come to our drum group. Come to our drum group and enjoy some of, the medicine, the relationship that we have to offer. And then they hosted us at the Islamic school and fed us wonderful food. And we introduced them to Indian tacos. We made vision boards. Like, it was a really lovely evening. And now tonight we're kind of stepping it up a little bit more, with speakers and small group discussions. But how do we, and we're expanding it into the Black community, how do we build relationships between our communities together, instead of each of us individually trying to seek belonging with the state that caused our dispossession in the first place?
Mm,
Like, why do we keep seeking belonging with these organizations that just exist to push us aside? Why don't we find a way to seek belonging together? And
mm,
as an Indigenous person, as somebody, who is privileged to live in the land of my ancestors, I feel the responsibility of generosity and hosting. It is my responsibility to reach out to these communities. And they are reaching out to us. They are reaching out, and so we need to reach back, because they do want to form relationships with us. And so that's really my call to Indigenous communities, is how are we enacting the generosity of our ancestors? Because that was never the problem. What colonialism did with that generosity is the problem. But who our ancestors were and the lessons they taught us was not the problem. So it's, who are we being generous with and to? And who
mm.
are we willing to form relationships with? And so that's, I feel, our responsibility. But then I'm also the daughter of German Ukrainian refugees on my maternal side. So I feel like in that lineage, I also carry the responsibility to be a good guest, to remember that I'm on the territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, not the Ojibwe Anishinaabe. So I have a responsibility to be a good guest in this place, and to think about my relationships to those communities, and to make sure that I am not participating in displacement, because sometimes we can do that too, right? Oppressed peoples can also participate in oppression. And so that's, kind of where I take that from my mother's side, is remembering not to participate in those systems. And so that's for me what transnational solidarities are about, is about getting our communities together, whatever those communities look like, and making friends,
Mm.
listening to each other, reading each other's stories, spending time with each other and learning how we live together. And then we start showing up for each other, right? We start showing up for each other in important ways because you show up for your friends. So, step one, let's make friends.
I love that. I was going to say, ask a question was bubbling up of what does it mean to be a good guest? And you kind of animated that with like, just, I guess what I'm taking from it is just how important it is to ask ourselves, is belonging an experience that's accessible to every member of our community? And being humble to recognize that, what does belonging mean? Maybe there isn't even a universal definition. I mean, I know there is, but meaning, you ask 20 people what belonging means, they might be saying that a little bit differently. But in my mind, I really think about the work of Stacey Haynes around, the politics of trauma, that can we, does the space, or does our community center the dignity, safety, and belonging needs of every person in the community? And so I feel like you said, like bringing, even having the curiosity to want to know other communities, to recognize that their stories are as valuable as ours. And that I always like to say, like, we don't fear the people whose stories we know, whose stories we find ourselves in or see ourselves in. And then the goal to me is to want to value and want to protect those stories as much as I want to value and protect my own. So I love all that you've named there. Um, and I know we talked about your book, Becoming Kin, but I'm also understanding that another book is in the works. So I'm wondering if you can give us, fans
Working
like
on it
me.
right now. Actually, it's up on another screen.
Love it. Well, fans like me would love to have a sneak peek or just a sense of, what's your focus this time? Is it building on kind of where you went in the book? Is it a new direction?
I had thought of it as a new direction, but it turns out that I'm building, which makes sense, right? So, Becoming Kin was challenging the stories that we tell about history, right? I spent so much time looking at history from other perspectives, tying things together. So, Becoming Kin was very much about challenging the stories we tell about history, and then how does that move us into a different present and future? So this story, tentatively called A Thousand Worlds, because I got to call it something, um, challenges all the stories. Okay, so let's challenge the stories we tell about science, the stories we tell about memoir and gender, and smash the patriarchy, and the stories, even the way we write fiction and speculative fiction. Like, are Indigenous people, are we even in the future? Yeah, right? Like, so many stories about the future, we're not even there. So let's just challenge all of the stories. And what does that bring us to? And that's A Thousand Worlds, of course, comes from the Zapatista concept of a world where many worlds can coexist. So that's what we're looking at, is it's not just a single story. It's There's all kinds of ways to study science and to understand science. There's all kinds of ways to talk about, gender and how we fit in, and how people fit into the world. There's all kinds of ways, and all kinds of different. And I started with Indigenous writers because it's built off that podcast series I did, A Year of Indigenous Reading. But even that started to feel too narrow, and almost like, at one point in the book, I say, okay, that focus was necessary to clear space, to get me thinking differently. But defending that space started to feel like defending colonial boundaries. And so then I start, well, who else is there? Who else is telling other stories? And then I start drawing in a subaltern. My editor says that's very academic, but secondary people. Subaltern can also mean secondary people, people who are pushed aside. What other stories do we all have to tell, and what happens when we put these stories together? So it kind of is a literary version of transnational solidarity. right? Putting our stories together. Whereas tonight at the mosque, we're putting our people together.
That is,
So yeah, so this is a really fun book to write.
oh my goodness, I'm excited. I can't wait to see it just to see where you go. And I love the way you write. I felt like your like Becoming Kin was accessible. And I continue to like recommend it to people. I had it here. I think I must have put it somewhere else, but um I had a question because we talked about Palestine quickly and recognizing that this show may air over many times, but it's going to definitely air in this context. But um, I wonder, like for folks who let's say have kind of understood as settlers, especially in recent years with things like the uncovering of Indigenous children's graves at residential institutions or residential schools that who are kind of understand like, okay, the story I told myself before is outdated and doesn't align with what I've learned now. I'm curious about what you would say or how you might speak to the connections between the experience of Indigenous people here in Canada and what's happening in Palestine.
The shortest, most concise way to think about it is that what we're watching and what has been happening for the last 75 years, because of course we're in the midst of a lot of Israeli violence right now, but the occupation has been ongoing for 75 years. So what we're watching is, the violence of 19th century colonialism, with the Indian Wars and the relocations and all of those things that I wrote about taking place with 21st century tech, because the processes are all the same, right? The relocation, the dismantling, the separation of families, the over incarceration of the population, all of those things are the same. And people will often say that, Jewish people are indigenous to that area, and that's fine. But you can have many indigenous people living together in one space. That's everything that the One Dish Treaty talks about. How are the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee going to live together in this space without interfering with each other? That's the way, Muslims and Christians and Jewish people lived in Palestine under the Ottoman Empire. They lived together. It was, it's a US backed occupation. So I'm not even, and I think that's a very important for people to know this is that this colonial state would not exist without the support of Britain and the US. I'm very careful when I speak publicly about this because I don't want to fall into anti-Semitic tropes about blaming, some kind of global conspiracy or, these, here they go again or anything like that. This is very much a US backed occupation. Israel was chosen as a strategic geographic spot by the US to support in the Middle East. And so I want to be very clear about that. But they're still enacting terrible violence. And it very much does mirror what happened in Canada, in the US, in Australia, in Africa. It's, the same story being told again and again and again.
Thank you. I've been sitting with that question when I knew I was going to talk to you. I'm like, I want to hear it from Patty because the way that you speak to it, I think really does bring some clarity. Just I love your voice and the way you weave your mind. I think I like to say that I'm curious about solidarity across difference, which I think is similar. So I think in terms of transnational, I don't use that language, but I see the connection around that it's going to take, in the words of Adrienne Marie Brown, no one is special and everyone is needed, right? And so how do we, not to simplify the complexity that many are feeling around this, and it's not that complex for, I think, those of us who do this kind of work, but I appreciate you taking the time to just kind of make those connections for folks who might not see what that is. Um, so it's a question. I have a question that I ask a lot of folks, especially doing this kind of work. And I think I might have even asked you in the previous interview, but like, how do you sustain yourself for this work, for these conversations? What does the practice of joy look like to you?
Funny that you mentioned Adrienne Marie Brown because I have her book right here, Fables and Spells. And I
Yeah,
have read this book like 3 times now. Um, that is giving me joy. Hanging out with my friends gives me joy. People that I can talk with who aren't, where I'm not having to parse my words or worry about white tears or any of those things. We can just get together and talk. I've got a couple of group chats that, yeah, I think we all know, kind of the power of the group chat, right? Where we can kind of just throw stuff out there and know that somebody's on the other side going to catch us, and just holding on to the relationships that way. My family, my writing, the feedback I get from people, all of those things, and then these relationships that we're building, like what's happening tonight, and the work that's gone on beforehand. All of those different ways that I engage with my community and the different layers, that's what keeps me grounded. And that's, I think, really important, because otherwise it's just me talking, right? There's no community informing what I say, and there's no community benefiting from what I say. And
Mm.
so keeping myself located in community, even if it's just people I share memes with, like that's really important. But yeah, Adrienne Marie Brown, Fables and Spells, is my current favorite book.
I love that, and yeah, it's I think why I asked that question is, and maybe my viewers like, why does she ask this? I think there is such a deep connection between joy and justice. That if we, and even in a hard time like right now that we've been living through, which is unprecedented, at least in our lifetime, I think joy is so important. And so I take little tips because I'm like, I love those inappropriate memes my friends share with me too. You need to have those belly laughs, right? Okay, so well, listen, I'm so grateful that I got to have time with you. Hopefully, my viewers are shaped by what you've shared, and definitely will wait to hear about when the book comes out. But I thank you so much for taking time to be a part of this conversation today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing up joy, because if we don't have joy, then what are we doing this for? Like, what's the point of building a world nobody wants to live in?
Exactly. And it cannot happen at the expense of ourselves. That's the thing. A lot of us in this space of, trying to build belonging in our communities, equity, inclusion, whatever people want to call it, engaging across difference. I think that's going to, for me, that's the why for me when it's really dark and things feel really overwhelming. It's coming down to community and what I can touch, my circle of influence. And that's really what I feel like I heard that from you today. So thank you. And to my viewers, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your suggestions of who to be in conversation with. Keep those coming. And until we meet next time, keep building bridges in community. Thank you.